What happens when a struggling single mother stands before a judge who listens not just to the law, but to her heart? On a cold Tuesday morning in Providence, Rhode Island, the familiar wooden doors of the municipal courthouse creaked open as another day of traffic violations and minor infractions began. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their sterile glow across rows of worn benches where dozens of people waited nervously, clutching crumpled tickets and rehearsing their explanations. But this wasn't just any courtroom. This was the domain of Judge Frank Caprio, a man whose reputation for compassion had spread far beyond the confines of Rhode Island. Among those waiting was Maria Santos, a 34-year-old mother of three, her hands trembling slightly as she held a parking ticket that might as well have been a bill for $1,000 given her current circumstances. She had taken the morning off from her job at the hospital cafeteria. Unpaid time she couldn't afford to lose, but she had no choice. The ticket was for $75, money that was supposed to buy groceries for her children that week. The courtroom atmosphere was different from what most people expected. Instead of the cold, intimidating environment often portrayed in movies, Judge Caprio's courtroom felt almost warm. His clerk, Frank Caprio, moved about with familiar efficiency, and there was an underlying sense that real human beings worked here. People who understood that behind every violation was a story, a struggle, a person trying their best in difficult circumstances. As Maria's name was called, she approached the bench with the cautious steps of someone who had learned to expect the worst from life. Judge Caprio looked up from his papers, his kind eyes meeting hers across the divide between bench and defendant. He didn't see just another traffic violator. He saw a tired woman, probably a mother, definitely someone carrying burdens heavier than a simple parking ticket. "Mrs. Santos," Judge Caprio said gently, his voice carrying the warmth that had made him beloved by millions who watched his show, caught in traffic. But this wasn't television. This was real life, with real consequences, for real people. The charge was straightforward: parking in a handicapped space outside the elementary school where her youngest daughter attended. The fine was standard, the law was clear, but something in Maria's posture told Judge Caprio there was more to this story. There always was. As she stood before him, Maria clutched a worn purse and kept glancing toward the courtroom doors, probably calculating how quickly she could get back to work, back to the endless cycle of making ends meet that defined her days. She had no idea that she was about to experience something that would restore her faith in both the justice system and human kindness. Judge Caprio studied the case file briefly, but his attention was really focused on the woman before him. In his decades on the bench, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people, to sense when someone was genuinely struggling versus someone simply trying to avoid consequences. Maria Santos, he could tell immediately, was genuinely struggling. "Tell me what happened that day," he said, leaning forward slightly, his tone inviting honesty rather than demanding explanation. What happened next would prove why Frank Caprio wasn't just a judge. He was a healer, a father figure, a beacon of hope in a system that too often forgot its humanity. But first, Maria had to find the courage to tell her story, and Judge Caprio had to do what he did best: listen with his heart. The courtroom grew quiet as Maria prepared to speak, unaware that she was about to experience something that would change not just her day, but her entire perspective on justice and mercy. No one expected what Judge Caprio would say next. As Maria Santos stood before Judge Caprio's bench, her story began to unfold like so many others he had heard over his decades of service. A tale of quiet desperation, small emergencies, and the impossible choices that define life for America's working poor. "Your Honor," Maria began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I was picking up my daughter from school. She's 8 years old and she has complications." She paused, the weight of those words hanging in the air. "Isabella was born with spina bifida. She uses a wheelchair sometimes, and that day was particularly difficult for her." Judge Caprio's expression softened immediately. He had heard thousands of explanations over the years, some genuine, some fabricated, many somewhere in between. But there was something in Maria's voice, a tremor that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry, that told him this was painfully real. "I work the early shift at Rhode Island Hospital," Maria continued, her hands now visibly shaking. I clean in the cafeteria from 4 a.m. to noon so I can be there when Isabella gets out of school. That day she had fallen during recess and the school nurse called. They said I needed to come immediately. In most courtrooms across America, judges deal with hundreds of cases daily, moving through them with mechanical efficiency. Time is money, dockets are crowded, and personal stories, no matter how compelling, rarely change the fundamental equation of violation plus fine equals payment. But Judge Caprio had long ago chosen a different path, one that prioritized understanding over expediency. When I got to the school, Maria explained, Isabella was crying. She had scraped her knee badly, and because of her condition, even small injuries can become serious problems. The regular parking spaces were all full. It was pickup time, and you know how crazy it gets. I saw the handicapped space, and I thought. She trailed off, clearly struggling with the memory. You thought your daughter qualified, Judge Caprio finished gently, no judgment in his tone. I thought about it for maybe 10 seconds, Maria admitted. I knew I didn't have the proper permit yet. We'd applied for it, but the paperwork was still being processed. But Isabella needed me, and I could see her through the school window, upset and in pain. So I parked there and ran inside. This was the moment that separated Judge Caprio from so many others in his position. Instead of lecturing about the law, instead of explaining why good intentions don't excuse violations, he leaned back in his chair and studied Maria with the eyes of a father, not just a judge. How long were you inside the school? He asked. Maybe 15 minutes. I helped clean Isabella's wound, spoke with the nurse about her condition, and carried her to the car because she was limping. When I came out, the ticket was on my windshield. Frank Pari, Judge Caprio's longtime clerk and friend, watched this exchange with the recognition of someone who had witnessed thousands of such moments. He could see the judge processing not just the legal facts, but the human reality behind them. This wasn't about a parking violation. It was about a mother's love, a family's struggle, and the impossible choices that poverty forces upon good people every day. Mrs. Santos, Judge Caprio said, his voice taking on the gentle tone that had made him famous, tell me about your situation at home. Most judges wouldn't ask such a question. Most judges would stick to the facts of the case. Illegal parking in a handicapped space, clear violation, standard fine. But Judge Caprio understood that justice without context isn't really justice at all. It's just bureaucracy. I'm raising 3 children alone, Maria explained. Isabella is my youngest. My older 2, Miguel and Sophia, are 12 and 14. Their father, he left when Isabella was diagnosed. Said he couldn't handle having a disabled child. The pain in her voice was unmistakable. I work as much as I can, but Isabella needs special care, physical therapy, doctor visits. I'm always taking time off, and my supervisor is starting to notice. This ticket, she gestured helplessly at the paper in her hands. $75 is groceries for a week. It's the copay for Isabella's therapy session. It's gas money to get to work. Judge Caprio had presided over tens of thousands of cases during his career, but each one like this still affected him deeply. He saw in Maria Santos every struggling parent, every person trying to do right in a system that seemed designed to punish the unlucky. He saw his own immigrant parents who had worked multiple jobs and made countless sacrifices to give their children better lives. Most judges would simply read the fine and move on, Judge Caprio thought to himself, as he often did in moments like these. But he had never been most judges. He was Frank Caprio, and Frank Caprio believed that the law should serve people, not the other way around. The courtroom had grown completely silent as Maria's story unfolded. Even the court reporter seemed to be typing more softly, as if afraid to disturb the sacred space of human connection that had formed between judge and defendant. Judge Caprio leaned forward, looked directly into Maria's eyes, and asked a question that no one in the courtroom expected. Mrs. Santos, when was the last time you did something just for yourself? The question hung in the air like morning mist, unexpected and profound in its simplicity. Maria Santos blinked several times, clearly caught off guard by Judge Caprio's inquiry. Around the courtroom, spectators who had come expecting routine traffic proceedings found themselves witnesses to something far more meaningful. I don't understand, Your Honor, Maria replied, her voice uncertain. Judge Caprio smiled, not the formal courtroom smile that many judges wear like armor, but the warm, grandfatherly smile that had endeared him to millions of viewers worldwide. "It's a simple question, Mrs. Santos. When was the last time you treated yourself to something? A cup of coffee that wasn't from a hospital vending machine? A movie? A quiet hour with a book?" The question revealed everything about Judge Caprio's approach to justice. While other judges focused solely on infractions and penalties, he understood that true justice required seeing the whole person, understanding the full context of their lives. He had learned long ago that behind every violation stood a human being with dreams, struggles, and a story worth hearing. Maria's eyes welled up with tears. "I can't remember," she whispered. Maybe before Isabella was born? I used to go to the library sometimes on weekends. I loved to read, but now—" She shrugged helplessly. "There's always something more important." Frank Caprio, who had worked alongside Judge Caprio for over 2 decades, recognized the signs. He had seen this transformation happen countless times, the moment when the judge stopped being a dispenser of legal consequences and became something more, a counselor, a father figure, a reminder that the world still contained unexpected kindness. "Your Honor," the prosecutor interjected gently, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the proceedings had taken. "The violation is quite clear. Mrs. Santos parked in a handicapped space without proper permits. The law doesn't provide exceptions for—" Judge Caprio held up his hand, not rudely, but with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades balancing law and compassion. "I understand the law perfectly well," he said, his tone firm but kind. "I've been applying it for longer than some people in this courtroom have been alive, but I also understand something else. Sometimes the law needs to be tempered with mercy." He turned back to Maria, his expression softening again. "Mrs. Santos, I want you to know that what you did, rushing to help your daughter, making sure she was safe and cared for, that's not a crime. That's love, and love should never be punished." The courtroom was completely silent now. Even the usual rustling of papers and shifting in seats had stopped. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something rare and beautiful, a moment when the machinery of justice paused to acknowledge the humanity it was meant to serve. "Now," Judge Caprio continued, "about this handicapped parking permit. You said you applied for one?" "Yes, Your Honor. Isabella's doctor filled out all the paperwork 6 weeks ago, but the DMV said it could take up to 3 months to process." Judge Caprio turned to his clerk. "Frank, get the DMV on the phone. I want to know why it takes 3 months to process a handicapped parking permit for a child with spina bifida." This was vintage Judge Caprio, not content to simply dismiss a ticket, but determined to address the systemic problem that had created the situation in the first place. He understood that true justice often required changing the system, not just responding to its consequences. As Frank Caprio made the phone call, Judge Caprio continued his conversation with Maria. "I'm going to dismiss this ticket," he announced, and the relief that washed over Maria's face was visible to everyone in the courtroom. "But I'm going to do something else, too." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, a gesture that had become legendary among those who followed his career. "I want you to take this," he said, holding out several bills. "I want you to go to that library you used to love, buy yourself a cup of coffee, find a good book, and spend an hour just being Maria, not Isabella's mother, not Miguel and Sophia's mother, not a hospital worker, just Maria." Maria stared at the money as if it were a foreign object. "Your Honor, I can't." "You can and you will," Judge Caprio said firmly, "because taking care of yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. Your children need you to be strong, and you can't be strong if you never rest, never recharge, never remember who you are as a person." The wisdom in these words came from decades of experience, both on the bench and as a father himself. Judge Caprio understood that the best gift he could give Maria wasn't just financial relief, but permission to value herself, to acknowledge that her needs mattered too. "Instead of a harsh penalty," Judge Caprio said, his voice carrying across the hushed courtroom, "I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to help you." The courtroom fell silent as the weight of those words settled over everyone present. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished. He had one more surprise that would prove why millions of people around the world had come to see him as more than just a judge. He was a symbol of hope, a reminder that compassion still existed in the world, a living example of what justice could be when it remembered its heart. As Maria Santos walked out of Judge Caprio's courtroom that day, clutching not a fine but a gift, both financial and emotional, she carried with her something far more valuable than the money he had given her. She carried proof that kindness still existed in the world, that there were still people in positions of power who chose to use that power to lift others up rather than tear them down. The story of Maria and Judge Caprio spread quickly through the courthouse, then through the community, and eventually around the world through social media and the judge's television show. But it wasn't unique. It was simply one beautiful example of what happened every day in Judge Caprio's courtroom, a place where justice wore a human face and the law served as a tool for healing rather than punishment. What made Judge Frank Caprio extraordinary wasn't just his individual acts of kindness, though those were remarkable. What made him extraordinary was his fundamental understanding that the justice system at its best should reflect the highest aspirations of human society. Not just our need for order and consequence, but our capacity for empathy, forgiveness, and love. Throughout his decades on the bench, Judge Caprio handled over 250,000 cases. Each one represented a human being at a difficult moment in their life, facing consequences for mistakes both large and small. While many judges approached these encounters as routine administrative tasks, Judge Caprio saw them as opportunities to teach, to heal, to inspire, and to remind people that the world still contained unexpected goodness. His philosophy was deceptively simple. Treat every person who comes before you as you would want to be treated if you were in their shoes. But implementing this philosophy required something much more complex: the ability to see past the surface of each case to the human story beneath, the wisdom to know when mercy served justice better than punishment, and the courage to act on that knowledge even when it meant going against convention. The impact of Judge Caprio's approach extended far beyond individual cases. Maria Santos, for example, didn't just walk away with a dismissed ticket and some spending money. She walked away with renewed faith in the fundamental fairness of the world, with validation that her struggles were seen and valued, and with permission to care for herself as well as others. These gifts rippled outward, affecting her interactions with her children, her coworkers, and everyone else she encountered. Multiply that impact by the hundreds of thousands of people who appeared before Judge Caprio over his career, and the millions more who watched his television show, and you begin to understand the true magnitude of his legacy. He didn't just dispense justice, he dispensed hope, reminding people that even in a world that often seemed cold and uncaring, there were still individuals who chose kindness over indifference, understanding over judgment. Judge Caprio's approach also challenged the broader justice system to examine its own practices and assumptions. When a judge becomes internationally famous, not for harsh sentences or clever legal reasoning, but for simple human decency, it raises important questions about how justice should be administered. His example suggested that the goal of the legal system shouldn't just be punishment and deterrence, but rehabilitation and restoration, helping people become better versions of themselves rather than simply making them pay for their mistakes. The judge often spoke about his own background as the son of Italian immigrants, people who worked multiple jobs and made countless sacrifices to give their children better opportunities. This personal history informed his deep empathy for those facing financial hardship, language barriers, or family crises. He never forgot where he came from or how easily circumstances could change anyone's life trajectory. His television show, Caught in Traffic, became a global phenomenon precisely because it offered something rare in modern media: genuine human connection without exploitation, kindness without condescension, and justice tempered with mercy. Viewers from around the world wrote to express how watching Judge Caprio had restored their faith in humanity, inspired them to treat others more kindly, or simply provided comfort during their own difficult times. Perhaps most remarkably, Judge Caprio maintained this approach throughout his entire career without becoming cynical or jaded. Despite hearing thousands of sob stories, some genuine, some fabricated, he never lost his ability to see the good in people or his willingness to give them the benefit of the doubt. This wasn't naivety. It was a conscious choice to believe in human potential even when that belief wasn't always rewarded. The legacy Judge Caprio leaves behind isn't just a collection of heartwarming stories, though those stories matter enormously to the people who lived them. His legacy is a model for how institutions can maintain their humanity even while carrying out their necessary functions, how authority can be exercised with both strength and compassion, and how individual choices, even in the most routine circumstances, can make profound differences in people's lives. This was just one case among hundreds of thousands, but it shows why the world called him America's nicest judge. Judge Caprio reminded us that justice isn't only about laws, it's about humanity, dignity, and the radical idea that every person who comes before the bench deserves to be seen as a complete human being, worthy of respect and understanding. And that is the legacy he leaves behind. Not just dismissed tickets or waived fines, but a renewed belief in the possibility that our institutions can reflect our highest values, that power can be used to heal rather than harm, and that sometimes the most important thing a judge can do is simply remind someone that they matter. Thank you for watching this tribute to Judge Frank Caprio. If his story touched you, please share it with others so his message of kindness and fairness can continue to inspire the world.